Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Skincare and Beyond. Today we are focusing on the topic very close to us here at Face the Future, sun damage. When we think about sun damage, most of us will picture the extremes, like really bad sunburn or peeling or even blistered skin, or maybe the signs of visible aging. But the reality is sun damage is often much less obvious than those extreme examples. And in dermatology clinics, sun damage doesn't usually show up as a one-off event. It's something that builds slowly over time, influenced by everyday exposure and daily habits that don't feel important at that moment in time. And because of that, sun damage is often misunderstood. Today, we're going to explore what sun damage actually looks like from a clinical perspective, how it develops over time, and what dermatologists really see in their day-to-day practice. To guide us through it all, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Emma Wedgeworth, consultant dermatologist and UK ambassador for one of the leading sun protection brands, HelioCare, with whom we've been partnered with for over 10 years. Emma, welcome to Skincare and Beyond.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to have you. So I'd like to start, if I could, with your background. I'm just interested to know what it was that first drew you to dermatology as a career choice.
So I've been a dermatologist now for about 20 years. And I think the thing that really drew me to it is the fact that skin conditions can really impact on people's quality of life. When you're becoming a doctor and you're choosing your specialty, you see all sorts of different ways that medical conditions can affect people. And I think because skin conditions are visible and because the skin is such a large organ and it impacts on so many things that we do day to day, if you have a problem with your skin, it can be really, really impactful. And as a result, treating people who have skin conditions can be incredibly rewarding.
Is there any personal experience in there as well?
So I've always had super fair skin. So I've had to be really, really careful in the sun. And so when I've seen people who've got sort of sun damage and things, it's something that really resonates with me because I've always been incredibly careful and incredibly aware of the fact that the sun can damage my skin very easily.
Is sun damage a specific branch of dermatology that you focus even more in as a dermatologist?
So I think every dermatologist has to embrace sun damage because the sun is such a key part of the way, for example, that our skin ages. So I work in a clinic which does partly medical, but also partly sort of cosmetic. And I do a lot of helping people to age in a healthy sort of way or to reverse some of the signs of skin damage. So most dermatologists will have to embrace the fact that skin changes over time with the sun, and be that through either treating skin cancers or from aging changes, the sorts of things that you might do in a cosmetic dermatology clinic.
What is it that you're seeing day to day most commonly in clinic, especially as it relates to sun damage as well?
So it starts pretty early on with things like pigmentation, fine lines, textural change, tone changes. So for example, redness, fixed blood vessels, all the way up to things like actual sort of skin cancers or growths and things like that. So you see it from very early on, which I think people don't often sort of understand. A lot of the changes that we do see from your sort of early 30s and so can actually be caused by sun exposure. We see all sorts of different aspects of sun and the way that it impacts on the skin.
Interesting. Some of those common things that you see, and it kind of lead on to my next question, that because you said it starts early on, what are the early signs that people either miss or maybe even dismiss as something that's not really that important as relates to sun damage?
Yeah, so pigmentation, for example, for women, there's a condition, melasma, which is often associated with, for example, hormonal changes, so people that are on the oral contraceptive pill or sometimes in pregnancy. It can start quite early, but it is a sign of sort of sun damage over time, and particularly sun damage that's happened early on in life. So it might be in the teenage years, in childhood, and then it shows up as pigmentation, which really gets much darker around the sun. And then, for example, even things like fine lines. So many of my patients in their even like late 20s will come in and say, actually, I've noticed much more lines like around my eyes or various different changes. And those sort of superficial fine lines may well be signs of early sort of sun damage. So these very subtle sorts of changes that we see often from our mid-20s, a slight loss of collagen, a slight change in the volume of our skin, increasing fine lines, pigmentation, sometimes increased roughness, slightly larger pore size. All of these are exacerbated by sun exposure.
I was just going to say, there's a lot of questions that I've got today that we'll get into, but fine lines and wrinkles is a part of aging. Is there a point where you would say, actually, the fine lines and wrinkles that you're exhibiting have definitely been exacerbated by exposure to sun?
I mean, sometimes you will see people who have accelerated skin aging, and that might be because they've had to work outside. They've had to work in hot, sunny environments. So some people that work in very hot, sunny climates. People who've got very fair skin. So like myself, if I'd have excessive sun exposure, you will start to see lines that occur earlier than you might otherwise expect it. So yeah, there are definitely times where as a dermatologist, you can tell that someone has had accelerated sort of aging because of excessive sun exposure.
Just think when you mention hot sunny climates, I'm picturing, you must have seen it, I think a lot of people have seen it, the truck driver example with one arm a lot darker than the other arm and, clearly exhibiting signs of exposure to the sun.
Exactly. So, being exposed to sun and UVA through a window for long periods of time. People, for example, who've lived in climates like Australia, you may find that actually they've got accelerated signs of aging. People who've grown up in hot, sunny environments. So there are lots of times where I see it, and you can actually correlate it with the fact that they have had quite a bit of sun exposure over time.
What do you think people often misunderstand about sun damage?
The fact that the skin has a very long memory. So we talked a bit before, you were mentioning about how people often think about sun damage as like burning, and burning will repair itself. So you get sunburned and then a few days later, actually, it will repair itself. But your skin has this memory. So every time you get burnt, your skin does remember that. And you have bits of your cells which will change a little bit every time that happens. So I think sun exposure that you've had when you're in your teens, even in childhood, in your 20s, that can show up later on. So sometimes I'll have people in clinic and I'll ask them, how much sun exposure have you had? And they sort of think I'm talking about the last few years. So they're like, oh, not much. And then when we go back over the decades, they're like, oh, well, actually, I did use sunbeds. I used to really sort of fry myself, all of those sorts of aspects. So I think that's something to be aware of, that whilst visibly the signs of sun damage may heal, your skin does have a memory, and that can turn up a lot later in life.
When you say it has a memory, what is it the skin's doing or remembering and storing for future use?
So essentially, the damage that can happen to our skin in the sun can actually change the way that our genetic material works. So, for example, within our cells, we have lots of different genetic material, DNA, and it can actually cause small changes within the DNA that then get replicated into the next cell. One change is fine, but actually the more changes you accumulate, actually that's what leads to skin cells going wrong and the way that they work becoming less efficient over time. So actually the more of those sorts of mistakes that develop in your genetic material that happen increases your risk of skin cancer, increases the visible signs of aging. And those are the sorts of changes that can be more permanent.
Wow. Okay, thank you for that. Is there a point where the damage becomes irreversible or very hard to reverse, whether it's visible or not?
Yes. I mean, once the skin cancer has developed, obviously that is a point of no return, for example, or once you've developed visible signs of aging, you can do things to help reverse it, but you can't fully reverse it. I mean, prevention is always much better than a cure. So once you've actually developed these sorts of changes, you then need to go in and fix that and then try and prevent further changes from happening. So there are a couple of messages here. One is it's never too late to start being sensible around sun exposure and careful around sun exposure. But also the other message, I think, is that there are ways of being safe in the sun. It's not like we're asking people to completely avoid the sun. There are some benefits of moderate sort of sun exposure, but you shouldn't be regularly burning. You shouldn't be regularly sort of seeing changes within your skin, and you shouldn't be sun seeking. Like, we actually advise, don't go out and try and change the color of your skin, because that's the sort of behavior that can lead to problems later down the line.
Yeah. And I think it is important to make sure people understand what they can and can't do or should and shouldn't do, because I think from a fear-mongering point of view, the other side of the coin is stay out of the sun, don't go out in the sun. But everyone, I mean, I do personally feel better when the sun's shining. You want to be outside. And it's not about saying you can never expose yourself to the sun.
I think that is a really important message. Sun exposure is what we call a J-shaped curve. And basically, if you think of like a hockey stick shape, if you have no sun at all, you have a risk. Your vitamin D is going to be low. It's, like you said, it's good for lots of different things. It's good for your mood. If you have a bit of sun exposure, that's the optimum sort of point. And then if you have way too much, your risk goes up really significantly in that sort of J shape. And everybody has a different type of curve. So, for example, somebody like me who's got really, really fair skin, I can't really have that much sun because I will burn very easily. Someone who's got darker skin can have a bit more sun exposure than me, but everyone, regardless of their skin type, is at risk if they expose themselves to excessive sun. So it's this really boring message of moderation, and that level of moderation is different for everybody because we all have different skin types.
I think the boring messages are often the ones that are most important, even though they're boring.
They're so boring.
I've got a few questions as we run through today that will all refer back to our annual report that we do, which is, as I mentioned off camera, it's the first time we met a couple of years ago. Every year we run a campaign around the importance of using SPF every day, called 365 Days of SPF, or in the leap year it was 366 days. One of the findings in the report was that 89% of people do associate UV exposure with serious risks. So people are aware of the importance of sun damage and are aware of it. But what we find is that behavior doesn't always match that awareness. Why do you think there's such a disconnect?
First of all, I think that sun exposure is one of those things that it can take years to show up as a problem. So whilst, you might burn, some people don't burn, they tan quite easily, and then actually they feel better short term, but they're not really thinking about sort of the long-term risk. So I think one of the problems with people not changing their behavior is that whilst they know the messages, this lag period in which it can, show up means that sort of instant gratification, particularly, you want to look good. And I would say that now, having that sort of mid skin type 3, like caramel colored skin, that's sort of what a lot of really, really pale people like me, I think we're getting better at doing skin tones. But actually, I think often people are going for that sort of tanned look. And I think they just want to get a tan and don't really think about the consequences long term. And I think it's hard if you're 18, 19, 20, it's really hard to think ahead of like when you're going to be older and wrinkled and things like that. You're not really living for that. You're like, oh, I actually like to get a tan. I like to look like that. So I think there's a big disconnect. And I think we're far too narrow in the way that we project skin tones. So I think actually this sort of ideal of this intermittent sort of skin type 3 tan skin is something that needs to be challenged.
You mean in terms of marketing materials or movies or Instagram?
I mean, often, you'll look at like, if you see someone really, really pale on the beach and you look at the comments or something in like the Daily Mail, not that obviously, I do read the Daily Mail. You're like, why is she so pale? Why is it this? That's because we have many different skin tones and we need to embrace all of those sort of different skin tones. So I think that's part of the issue. But I think also it's just this sort of short-term gratification and not understanding the long-term implications.
Yeah. I mentioned everyday exposure and habits in the opening part of this podcast. I do want to come back to that. I said most people will think of sun damage as a one-off event just when I go on holiday. I know I certainly, when I was a young teenager, going on holiday with my boys. But it's not that simple. How much sun damage is about that cumulative everyday exposure that we're just not really thinking about or considering?
So I think it really depends on what we are looking at in terms of sort of sun exposure. So for example, if we look at skin cancer risk and we look at the UK, we would say that basically the UV index between something like April to October is when you are more at risk of skin cancers. And that can happen if you're just walking down the street midday and on a June, July day. That is definitely enough to cause sort of cumulative damage. If you're looking at the sort of aging changes that can happen within the skin, so that might be pigmentation, it might be wrinkling, it might be the change in texture or tone of the skin, then actually that can happen all year round. Because actually, if you think about it, so much of our exposure does happen in those months that are not hot and sunny. And there is no doubt that the UV index is way, way lower between October to April. And even UVA, whilst it is more constant throughout the year, it is still lower. But the cumulative aspect of that is what actually creates those sorts of other changes. Basically, once you're exposed to daylight, there is something there that can contribute to the sort of damage of the skin.
I think I know the answer to this, but what I was going to ask is what are the most common everyday habits that contribute to long-term sun damage? And when I say I think I know the answer, I guess it's because perhaps in April it's not that warm, there might be a little bit of sunshine, so I might go outside and walk the dog and not think it's that important to be applying anything or covering up because it doesn't feel that warm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a huge cohort of people who would only wear sunscreen if they're on a beach. And that is, I think, what we want to try and change. We know that in the UK, for example, our UV index is increasing significantly. We're living longer, touch wood, as a population. So our skin has to last us longer. So actually, we need to be able to look after it on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to just thinking that this is something that happens on a beach, or for some people, they think they can just put sunscreen on so they can stay out longer without getting burnt. And that's not always what we want them to do as well. We want them to be safe in the sun and protect and use sunscreen as almost like the last line of defense. But I think I see it from very early on, though. For example, kids out on sports day or playing cricket or things like that, things that actually over time can really increase the UV exposure. And we want kids out and about, and we want everyone to be having fun and to enjoy the outdoors. But I think just being careful about sun protection.
Yeah. I have another example of that, actually. So last year, as part of our SPF campaign, we sponsored the Leeds Marathon. And our team went out and were handing out SPF samples. And at the same time as handing out the samples, they were asking the runners, because it was a very hot, sunny day as well, it was a beautiful day, have you applied SPF before coming out for your run? And the honest answer was no. Almost like, well, why would I? But they were all grateful for the sample sunscreens that they got at the end of the race.
Yeah. I think that's such a good initiative. Often when you do see people out playing tennis or like jogging or whatever, my first thing is like, are you wearing sunscreen? Because I think people often do forget about it at that point.
Do you think people underestimate just the everyday incidental exposure to sun?
I think that the cumulative sort of exposure over time and how high the UV index can sometimes be in the UK, I think people do underestimate that. And I think people are just not very good at always sort of putting it at the top of their list.
Do you think people should be mindful of what the forecast is from a UV index point of view?
Yeah, I think it's helpful. However, I would say just get into the habit of using sunscreen every day, April to October. The problem is if you sort of second guess it, or you can't find your phone and then you're not sure, it looks cloudy outside and then you think I don't need it, and then you get caught out. Cloud cover isn't always perfect. So I think generally I would say that if you're just looking at sort of skin cancer risk, April to October, absolutely. If you want to just improve the general nature of your skin and do everything you can to try and prevent aging changes, just wear SPF every day.
That's an interesting segregation between the two, aging versus skin cancer risk.
Yeah, I mean, they are linked because obviously if you show signs of accelerated aging, that is changing the nature of your skin, the efficiency of your skin. But the UV index between sort of October and April in the UK classically is not high enough always to sort of increase that. But I wear SPF every day because actually I know that even in the sort of winter sun, so I'm very freckly, and it's a really good barometer of what's happening outside, because even when you're walking outside for a bit and you don't think it's that strong, you come back and you can see very quickly changes of pigmentation. So I think in some ways I've got this natural inborn barometer of the UV index, which has forced me to basically use sunscreen every day.
That's a good barometer to have. Interestingly, again, I'm segueing, I wear SPF every day as well. I often ask my daughter when she's going out, has she got SPF on? And the answer will actually come back in the form of UV index. Well, actually, I've checked the UV index and I don't need to wear it today. Because I think she saw something on TikTok and that told her, this is when you need to, this is when you don't need to.
Well, if it's on TikTok, I mean, we're going to believe everything there. I think the UV index is a reasonable option when you look at the weather and it's very high and you know that you need to wear it. But I think it's not an absolute aspect. So like I said, get into the habit. I would always tell my daughter April to October every single day. And then going forward, I think as she gets a bit older, I'll be like, that should be part of your routine.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to focus on long-term consequences for a moment. And going back to our report that we recently carried out, our survey with our customers, millennials fear skin cancer more than older generations do, but we are still seeing rising cases. I'm intrigued to know whether that finding aligns with what you're seeing in clinic.
Yes. I mean, I definitely see a cohort of people who are very good at sort of looking after themselves and very aware of their own sort of health and trying to prevent damage. And I think we see that hopefully in sort of younger generations. I would say they're quite careful about, what they eat. I think if you look at things like drinking patterns, alcohol, that's going down.
Yeah.
Exercise is becoming much more mainstream. And I think skincare is sort of part of that. People are aware that actually we do have agency in the way that we age and our longevity and our health. Sometimes I would say there is a little bit of inconsistency. So for example, people are like, I wear SPF every day, but then if you ask them about their habits when they're abroad and they still sunbathe, and they're like, oh no, that doesn't quite work. SPF every day is great, but it is not the be all and end all. And actually SPF should not be used instead of safe sun habits. So I think as a society, I think young people are becoming more involved in sort of the way that they want to look after themselves.
Yeah, no, I see that as well. Interestingly, in the report, there's a smaller cohort, I would say 1 in 10 people, who say neither aging nor skin cancer worries them at all. How do you deal with that cohort of people that just seem to not give a jot?
Can you imagine being like that? I mean, I'd love to be like that. Nothing worries you so much. I know, that would be amazing. There's also an element where people have to make their own decisions. I will sometimes in clinic, I will say to people, look, that excessive sun exposure will age you. And some people say, yeah, you're telling me that, and I still choose to sunbathe. And it's a bit like people know that smoking is really harmful, but we still sell cigarettes, we sell a lot less. But there'll always be a cohort of people that choose to do things that, actually they know have a certain amount of damage, and that's a sort of considered a risk. I say that in a completely non-judgmental way. Actually, for example, I drink alcohol. I mean, I'm not saying I drink loads of it, but, I do drink a bit of it, and I know that alcohol doesn't really have any health benefits. So I think all of us have a different relationship with risk and what we choose to do. That's people's choice. We have free choice.
Yeah. And her to have so few worries.
I mean, I aspire to be like that. I think when you have to be careful, though, is what you do, for example, for your children. So I always think about, on my watch, I don't want my children to be harmed by things. I think that's one thing to be aware of, because actually, if you're not showing any regard for your skin, that's totally up to you as an adult. But when I see children who are burnt or children who are put in the sun or things like that, it makes me a little bit sad, because as parents, I think that's, sort of part of bringing our children up in a way that is keeping them as healthy as we possibly can.
Yeah. I do think there's a positive change in terms of people's understanding of how important it is, though. I'm certainly not trying to blame anything on my parents, but I've got pigmentation and it's more visible during sunnier periods. And then I now look back and think, well, if I would have applied more SPF at a much younger age, I say, not necessarily saying when I was, pre-teens and it was my parents' fault, but even, let's say, going on boys' holidays or anything like that. But yes, certainly I think there's more awareness now on how important it is. And you often see people on the beach trying to apply sunscreen to toddlers that don't want to sit still and be lathered in sun lotion.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of my patients will say, well, my parents didn't know about sunscreen. And the next generation will always blame their parents for something, but the awareness wasn't really there. That also the sunscreens weren't quite there. So I remember growing up when sunscreens were nowhere near as advanced as they are now. The advice was very, very different. But all you can do is your best, right?
Absolutely. Here at FTF, we like to myth bust, or at the very least correct misconceptions. What are the biggest misconceptions you see around SPF?
So I mentioned one about SPF, just wearing SPF every day is enough. And that's what you need to do in terms of your sun protection. And SPF's a really, really good way of helping with sun protection, but it is sort of a last line of defense after behavior and sort of covering up. That sunscreen causes problems. So we have a lot of people who don't use sunscreen because actually they're worried that it can cause issues. So there's quite a lot on social media about could it cause changes, endocrine disruption or things like that. And there's just no evidence at all that sunscreen in the way that we use it causes problems. But there's plenty of evidence that if we burn our skin, that it causes damage going forward. That all sunscreens are equal. So there are differences between different sunscreens. So even if you look at an SPF 50 versus an SPF 30, whilst those are different, but even different SPF 50s can be quite different in the way that they're formulated. So I think quite a few misconceptions out there about sunscreen.
I was going to ask a question. Are all SPFs created equal? The answer is no.
No.
So two SPF 50s, we don't have to name brands, but why would two SPF 50s not be the same?
The whole science behind sunscreen is, for me, fascinating, but obviously I'm biased, but also really, really complex. So when you look at an SPF 50, what that basically tells you is how much more time you can spend in the sun without burning than if you didn't have sunscreen on. So essentially, SPF 50 is thought to give you 50 times more protection from burning than if you didn't have sunscreen on. Now, the main wavelength of light that causes burning is UVB. So fundamentally, the SPF is very much a marker of how much UVB protection you have. What that doesn't tell you necessarily is how much UVA protection it has. In the UK and in the EU, we actually have really good sort of checks and balances around the way that our sunscreen is regulated. And so we know that the UVA ratio has to be at least a third. But beyond that, the SPF doesn't tell you how much UVA protection it has. Okay. It also doesn't tell you if it extends a bit further into things like visible light or infrared. So there are lots of differences around different sorts of sunscreens.
UVA, A for aging, B for burning? That's what I've been told.
Do you know what? That
oversimplification.
B is definitely for burning.
Okay.
But we know that UVB exposure also causes a lot of aging. If you repeatedly burn, you are going to age much faster than if you don't. So it's not as simple as that. And I think that's when we were talking before, weren't we? Before about how, social media has and the internet is fantastic about lots of things, but it has sort of oversimplified some of these sorts of messages. So UVB is very high energy. It's shorter wavelength, so it doesn't get as deep down, but it's very high energy. It's going to damage your skin. It's going to age your skin. UVA doesn't burn as much, but it does go a bit deeper down. It causes a bit more in the way of wrinkling. It does age as well. It contributes a bit to skin cancers, but not quite so much. So broadly speaking, you can think of UVB burning, UVA aging, but it's a little bit more complex than that.
Yeah. I guess the difficulty with social media is that, again, we talked about the attention economy earlier, that you've only got so many seconds to say something. So a really short, sharp message like that, although it's far more nuanced, is easier to deliver, I guess.
And nuance is boring. You see, pretty much everything I say is boring because there's nuanced and common sense and all of this sort of stuff.
I guess another question in terms of misconceptions, the UK, people in the UK, I mean, this is worldwide, but let's focus on the UK for a minute. Do you think people here tend to underestimate the need for SPF? You know, you mentioned that you wear it every day, but our stats, certainly from the research, we show that people definitely don't, or a large part of people don't, and don't believe they have to.
Yeah, I think people do underestimate the potential for sort of sun damage, and also underestimate how much you have to use. I think that's a really big issue. You know, if I look at how much the average person puts on, it's like a tiny amount. Or people tell me that their facial SPF is lasting them months on end. I'm like, what? How much are you using? So I think definitely there's a bit of underestimation of how often we have to use sunscreen, of how much we have to use. And then sometimes I think there's an overestimation of what sunscreen can do. It's not the panacea. It's brilliant. And, you know, for people like me who are fair-skinned, I think it makes a massive difference to my life. I can actually go out and feel more confident that I'm not going to burn and I'm not going to do various different things. To me, it really makes a difference to my life. But I know that it's not the be-all and end-all in terms of sun protection.
I also wonder where practicalities comes into it as well, because you mentioned about how much you use and people having a SPF that's lasted for months on end. I mean, I'm guilty of it myself. Reapplication throughout the day. A lot of people think they're doing enough. Like, I wear SPF every day, so I think I'm doing enough. But in reality, what actually is enough? How much we should be using? How often should we reapply? Especially outside of summer as well.
Yeah. So facial wise, it all depends on like the body surface area that you're applying it to it. So for your face, it's sort of half a teaspoon or 2 of your finger lengths of sunscreen. And that's something that you do sort of first thing in the morning. And then if you are out and about in direct sunlight, you should be reapplying every couple of hours. On a winter's day, I won't reapply unless I'm like, I don't know, in really hot winter sun. Not that it's on a hot winter sun, but, you know, if I'm walking down the street and it's very sunny, I might do something different. But if you're in the sun or you're at the beach or you're having a picnic, then you should be reapplying. For your body, to get the right sort of lab conditions, it's almost a shot glass, which is like 30 mils. That's a lot. In some areas, it may not be possible to do that much, but that's sort of what you should be aspiring to. So you should put a bit on and then put a bit more on, because the likelihood is you are under applying the amount. And keep an eye. So for example, if you're going on holiday and you're taking a couple of bottles, have in mind how many bottles you are using, because actually if you're going home with like 3/4 of your sunscreen full, you're not using enough. So it's important.
And again, personal question now then, is there a difference between, cause I'm not a child anymore, but I prefer sprays over, you know, a lotion. Is either fine, or is one better than the other?
So I use sprays as well for my body. I don't use them for my face because I think it's very, very difficult to, with your eyes and your mouth, to actually get that on board. You have to be aware if you're using sprays that there's going to be a certain amount of wastage, because actually some of the particles disperse and don't necessarily go on where you're spraying it. So try and just hold it as close as possible to where you're going. And again, just be aware of how much you're using. In an ideal world, I would say probably lotions are better. But the other pragmatic aspect is that the best sunscreen is the one that you're going to use.
Yeah.
So if you get a lotion, but you're like, oh, I hate it, it's too sticky and I can't apply it and my hands get sandy and blah, 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 that's not going to work. So actually something that you're going to use is much better, but just be aware that the sprays sometimes can, like, there's a bit more wastage in terms of that.
So happy with the sprays, but I might need more of them.
Absolutely right.
Okay, great. Just moving back to our report, another finding, 44% of Brits say that skin cancer scares them more than aging does, but we still see that inconsistent SPF use. Why do you think that in this case, because fear sells, you know, fear promotes action, but in this case, it doesn't appear to be leading to the action? People are fearful of skin cancer, but not necessarily taking the right action.
Number one, sunscreen is a bit of a hassle to put on. You often just forget. And it's not that immediate aspect. You know, skin cancer takes decades to actually appear. People are not really seeing it. I think once you've had a skin cancer, I think you're much more likely to do it because you had to go through having it removed and the fear and the concern that it might spread. But I think it is that lag period that it's really, really hard for people to understand that it can cause problems.
Yeah, I understand. And as you say, it's one of those things where it takes so long to manifest that I'll deal with it another day.
Absolutely.
So in terms of practical changes people can make then, for anyone that's listening or watching this episode that are questioning their own day-to-day habits, What are the few changes that you think they can make that will make the biggest impact?
Definitely try not to be too scared of the sun, because actually everyone wants to go out and enjoy nice weather. That's great, but just be a bit aware. So do wear your sunscreen. Make sure that that's something that you're using on a regular basis. You're using enough, you're reapplying it enough. Also think about sort of behavior, and particularly if you've got very light colored skin, you want to be careful that maybe you're not going out on the hottest part of the day. You're not doing a run at 1 o'clock in the afternoon or midday, and that you are covering up, and that you're just aware of the sun a little bit so that you're enjoying it, but in a safe way.
Awareness is key. We've obviously talked a lot about SPF as well, but it's confusing, and you've talked about not all SPF 50s being created equal. When people are searching for the product that's going to suit their routine, what do you think people should prioritize when choosing sun protection?
You have to think about what you're sort of trying to achieve with your product. So, for example, is it a facial product? Is it a body product? What type of consistency do you want? What type of skin have you got? If you've got oily skin, you want to go for something that's oil-free and quite light. If you've got dry skin, you want to go for a more hydrating formula. You want to look at things, for example, a lot of sunscreens now will have sort of added benefits. So, for example, I'm very freckly and I might look for one that's helping a bit more with pigmentation. Somebody who's got more sort of oily skin might be looking at oil control. So all of these sort of added aspects. I always go for a high SPF, like SPF 50. I generally don't advise things under that, because I know then that it's got a good level of UVA protection, because like I said, that isn't always marked on it. You do want to see that it says broad spectrum, and normally it will have a UVA in a circle. It may say, long wave UVA. Those are the sorts of things that are important. The other thing that is really important is that it's sustainable and that you can afford it, because sunscreen is really expensive. And so it's all very well me sitting here and being like, oh, you should use loads of sunscreen, but it's expensive. So you need to find something that actually fits within your budget. And I would say the good news is that there are lots of good sunscreens across lots of different sorts of budgets.
Yeah. And hopefully we can make those budgets go a little bit further if we manage to successfully remove the VAT from sun care products.
Honestly, it's astonishing that it's still sort of on there and almost like classified as like a beauty product.
Yeah, a luxury item that you don't need. You talk about products that what type of product do you want? If you've got oily skin, using oil-free, etc. What are your views on like moisturizers that have SPF built in? Sufficient, or should we be using a separate SPF?
So I think in this day and age, actually, I'd much rather use a hydrating sunscreen as my moisturizer than use a moisturizer that's got sunscreen as a sort of afterthought. When you formulate a product, if you're formulating a moisturizer, your primary goal of it is to hydrate your skin. Whereas when you're formulating a sunscreen, the primary role is to protect against the sun. So I find that generally there are enough great products out there that are primarily sun protection, but have lots of moisturizer. And that's sort of the way I think about it. And exactly the same with makeup, right? Instead of trying to pick a makeup that's got a little bit of a, SPF 30 as an, second thought, actually go for a nice tinted sunscreen, which has got that level of protection.
Yeah. My next question was going to be makeups as well. A product that has got an SPF 50 in it, does that professor still do the same level of coverage as a sun protection product that's created for sun protection?
If you use enough of it, the problem is are you really going to use those 2 full lengths of foundation? Or are you just going to use a little bit of foundation to sort of cover up? And it really does depend. And it also depends on where you are. So for example, if you're at home and you're blending in a foundation and you're going to use that much, and you can use something to blend it in and you can sit in front of the mirror fine. If you're on the beach, there is no way you're going to end up doing that. And then it's messy and difficult. So the reality is that, some foundations which have SPF 50, if you use enough of it, would be that. But I mean, as someone that wears a lot of, foundation every day, I don't even wear that much. So I would find it difficult to get my sun protection wholly from my makeup.
Yeah. And I guess the other key in there as well, the same way as you mentioned, friends that have got SPFs that have lasted them months on end, is how long is that foundation with SPF in it lasting you? Because it shouldn't last very long.
No.
Because some of them are really small.
Yes.
I do want to move on to HelioCare specifically in a moment. Before I do, if people watching or listening could take away just one thing from this conversation as it relates to sun damage and looking after our skin health, what would it be?
Don't ignore it, because it will catch up with you, and be sensible. Don't go out and try and excessively change the color of your skin. Do think about sun, because over time it is one of the really important key factors that can damage our skin. So even though it's a long way down the line. Don't ignore it and be sensible in the sun.
As you said as well, in terms of skin, it's going to be with us for a long time. And it's the biggest organ in our body.
I know. And when it goes wrong, that's when you really start to notice. Often people don't really think about their skin that much. They want to look good. But when it goes wrong, you really think about your skin. So, you don't know sort of how good you got it until it actually starts to go wrong.
How much percentage of the people you see in your practice are coming to you because of sun-related issues with their skin?
I mean, pretty much all aging changes will be related to sun. So a really high percentage, probably about 40% of my patients are coming for sort of anti-aging concerns, and that might be sort of pigmentation or lines or things like that. And that's all related to sun. It's not saying that that's the only reason we age, because we do age for different sort of reasons. But the superficial sort of changes that we see with aging are 80%, 90% driven by sun exposure over time.
So let's move on to Heliocare then. As mentioned earlier on, it's one of the best-selling SPF brands on our site. It has been for a number of years, and it's been one of our longest-standing brand partners. But I think I used to think about SPF as something we apply topically. But Heliocare takes a slightly different approach to sun protection. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I've worked with Heliocare for a long time, and they've really had this really progressive approach to sun exposure. If you look at sort of the history of sunscreens, I find it fascinating because when it first came out, it was all about just stopping from burning, like right back in the 20s or wherever. And over time, it's really evolved to try and give us this broad spectrum protection for basically all of the different parts of sunlight that can damage our skin in different ways. We talked a bit about UVB burning, UVA causing deeper changes in pigmentation. We know that visible light can cause pigmentation, infrared can change things. And that's what Heliocare, I think, does so well, is to really help give you this broad spectrum protection. And so it's got amazing products that you put on the skin. So all of its sunscreens are really great, and it takes into account the different types of skin we talked before about, breakouts and blemishes and sensitive skin and pigmentation, redness. But it also has an oral supplement which helps to improve your sort of daylight protection from inside out. And it's really important to know that the tablet is not a substitute for sunscreen, but it's an added level of protection that gives you antioxidant protection. And so particularly for people who are particularly sensitive to sun, so for example, people who've got like a sun allergy, something called polymorphic light eruption, people who get, for example, melasma pigmentation, it can just give you that little bit of extra boost from inside out. But they will always emphasize that it is not a substitute for topical sun protection.
Okay. I was going to ask you, in terms of the supplements that Heliocare offer, how does that fit as a full strategy for sun protection? But I think you kind of just answered that, really, in terms of it's really for those people that have got extra susceptibility to being affected by the sun.
Yeah, I mean, anybody can actually take it. It's in terms of antioxidant protection. So what it's doing is sort of helping to mop up the extra bits that perhaps some of the UV filters, when you put topically, aren't covering, or for example, just giving you an added layer of protection, because we know that actually the more protection you can get, the better. But particularly for people who do get things like polymorphic light eruption, which is like a sun allergy, people who find that within about 24 hours of being in quite hot sun, they get quite itchy, and then it ruins people's holidays. Or for people who get pigmentation, it just gives you that added layer of protection.
Yeah. So would you recommend people consider both, or but as you say, it's not a replacement for topical?
Definitely not a replacement for, but it's just another really advanced sort of way of actually helping to protect. It's got a fascinating story as well. So it comes from a fern from South America, and basically the fern moved from living in the sea, so from a sort of aquatic environment, to living on land, and it had to adapt because there was a lot more sort of sun, and so it produces chemical called Polypodium leucotomus, and that's what's in this tablet. So it's a really great way of looking at how organisms, in this case, sort of fern, has adapted to the harsh, sort of more sunlight conditions, and how we can actually harness those sorts of maneuvers and help our skin.
Okay, I think the fern might come into play on my next question. So obviously Heliocare leans heavily into science, and the brand also talks a lot about fern block technology. So I was going to say, can you tell me a little more about fern block technology? But I'm wondering if it's got anything to do with the fern.
I mean, exactly right. I've one step ahead of you. I think it's a really amazing story, and we do have some of these stories where actually we really look to nature for actually how we can improve things, and the sort of scientific aspects that evolution have brought. And so it's a really advanced way. And there's a lot of studies, actually. As a doctor, I'm always looking for evidence. And so there are a lot of different studies that polypodium as a supplement can actually be very helpful to give us that added layer of sun protection. Again, I'm not somebody that tends to say, look, take lots and lots of different supplements. But when I'm going away, because like I've said before, I'm very fair and my family are too, that I'll use that as an added layer of protection because I basically need all the help I can get in terms of sun protection.
Just in terms of HelioCare as a brand, there's lots of brands out there, and there might be people listening and watching that are saying, I already use an SPF 50, so I'm fine. For HelioCare, what is it that they represent in the market? What gap are they trying to fill? If someone already uses an SPF 50 and they're happy enough with what they're using, why would someone consider HelioCare as an alternative?
Yeah, so I think the real benefits and what drew me to sort of working with them was the fact that they've got this fantastic broad spectrum protection. And that makes sunscreen much more relevant for lots of different skin tones. So if you look at somebody like me who's got very light skin, I can't stay out in the sun long because I'm going to burn. So I really need this sort of higher UVB protection. Someone that's got darker skin, they won't necessarily burn that easily, but they'll get pigmentation, the texture of their skin will change, and they may well be more susceptible to things like UVA and visible light. And so actually, when we're thinking about what sort of sunscreens we need that are fit for purpose for all of the different skin tones that we have, I think something like HelioCare in its quite advanced sort of broad spectrum protection is a sunscreen that's sort of fit for all skin tones. So that's the first thing, that actually, because it does protect against lots of different types of light, it's much more relevant for all skin tones. Then it's very good at actually looking at different types of skin as well. We're not all the same. Some of us will find that, we break out easily if we use too much sunscreen, or we get irritated, or we've got a little bit of redness. And so what it's really tried to do is within its sunscreen is to include a bit of skincare as well. So rather than using our skincare as our sun protection now has got added skincare benefits. Yeah. And I think that's really helpful. And the textures are great as well. So for example, we talked about sprays, like their invisible spray for summer. I absolutely love, my kids love it. And it's a nightmare trying to get sunscreen on teenagers. So I'm like, it's so sticky, I don't want to use it. Whereas, this is a brilliant formulation. You can put it on wet skin. So they've been really innovative in the way that they actually produce it, because sunscreen is a pain to use. And so actually the more beneficial we can use it, sticks or various different things to help it, the better.
Yeah. By the way, it's not limited to teenagers. If you ask Julia, I'm the same. So I use a spray. She uses a lotion, and I say, I'm not putting it on, it's too sticky, I'm using a spray.
I mean, look, I'm not going to lie. I don't like it either. I find it, that actually lotions and things, and then your hands are sticky, and then sand sticks to you. It's a pain. I get it. So anything that we can do that makes it a bit easier, I think is a good thing.
I'm here for the spray. And I guess my last question on this kind of subject was linked to that practicality piece as well. And HelioCare is really good for that because of the range of products they've got. Because as you say, if it's not going to fit into your routine, not going to use it, then it's just not going to work anyway. So HelioCare are really good for that, having a complete range of products. So there's something for everyone there.
Honestly, when you go away with me, it is a nightmare because I've got like the spray, I've got the stick, I've got the cream, I've got a tinted, I've got a non-tinted. And my children are like, oh no, here we go. But because actually I need sunscreen so much, it's a big part of what makes my holiday a lot more enjoyable. And if I have these different bits, so that actually if I need a quick top up, I can use a stick, but I want a spray for a full bit. And then I might use a lotion when I want to be more fixed in terms of on my face and be a bit more like accurate in where I'm putting it. So I think ideally you do want a few different options in your armamentarium.
And actually we've got a lot of new parents in our team, and there's going to be more to come as well. And so some of them have some really good things to say about the pediatric range as well.
Yeah, that's a really great range. Sunscreen in little ones is difficult because, often they're sort of wriggling around and they don't want to get it, or they've got more sensitive skin. So it's a really nice range for them.
Yeah. Just moving on to the final segment. Do you remember asking a question of our audience?
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
we've got some answers. So I'll just remind everyone of the question. So remind for the people watching, listening, I'm not reminding you, I'm telling you for the first time. In the past 5 years, how many episodes of sunburn have you had, and what was happening on those days? We've had some answers that not all answered both parts of the question.
Okay.
So the first answer with a big smiley face is 0. So that person's very lucky. Second response we had was 0. Since having BCC removed, SPF 50 is my best friend.
Okay.
BCC. Can you just explain for our viewers and listeners what that is?
Yeah, so BCC is a basal cell carcinoma. This is the most common skin, well, it's the most common cancer in the UK, and it's a very superficial form of skin cancer that develops either as like a non-healing area or a little bump within the skin or a little ulcer, and they're really, really common. The good news about them is that if you catch them early, you just basically remove them, and that's a cure. Whilst it's really scary to hear that you might have a diagnosis of skin cancer, many skin cancers, if you get it early, are actually very, very treatable and curable. But again, the main thing that drives basal cell carcinomas is sun exposure.
I mean, I don't have a name alongside that comment, but appreciate whoever it was that got in touch to tell us about that one. I'm glad to hear that SPF is now your best friend.
Yeah.
Number 3, yes, I burned my forehead really badly skiing earlier this year, and I felt so guilty.
Oh, I mean, look, you've got a lot of enlightened listeners, because I did a survey at one of my kids' schools a couple of years ago and asked a range of 11 to 18-year-olds how often they got burnt. And within a couple of years, I mean, 70% of them or so had reported an episode of sunburn. I'm very impressed by your listeners.
I think the skiing one is interesting as well, because you do often, I don't know if you've been skiing, and you see people with you can still see the goggle mark. And I guess that's because, people are not assuming it's cold. It's Absolutely. 0 degrees, but it's very sunny.
Skiing is a challenge for the skin. The snow reflects so much of the UV. You're high up. You've then got all sorts of other things. So I think skiing is a massive challenge for the skin, and we see a lot of burning with that. I think my point around the question was actually, for many people, burning is a regular aspect, and it really shouldn't be. We can prevent sunburn. If you have repeated episodes of sunburn, it will cause you problems and it will catch up with you. And so people who are like, oh, I always burn I get a lot of it in clinic. People, I always burn my nose. I'm like, no, that stops now. So let's get on this. Actually, it's not okay to burn. I mean, of course, don't go and, feel really guilty and whatever, but really we shouldn't be burning. I mean, I can't remember, I think maybe once in my teenage years. And I know I sound really annoying, and my children will be like, oh, here she goes. But all I'm saying is, I think if you are really, really aware, you've got the right tools there, even with the fairer skin, you can avoid it.
I'm just thinking about you saying that your children are like, there, here she goes. I don't mind admitting I got burnt last year. And I remember, again, I was so embarrassed. I was thinking, we promote this message of SPF usage every single day and how important it is. And I burnt myself.
Look, it's not easy. And my teenagers have burnt themselves, and it's a source of great shame to me. I'm here admitting it to a whole audience, but very, very easy to do. Don't get me wrong. And I'm a dermatologist. I spend a lot of time, and my children would say I'm extreme. I cover up. I use a lot of sunscreen, but I think it's really important that we don't think it's okay to burn our skin, and that we really are mindful of what it can do to us.
And maybe it is because of our audience have heard us and read about us campaigning for so long, because actually there are a couple more answers that I won't go through, but it appears that people do understand, or at least the people that responded do understand. Someone saying, I used to use tanning oils, but I'm now paying the price, unfortunately, and won't do it again.
I think that's the thing. So if I look at the age groups that come into clinic, I would say that the younger age groups are pretty happy-go-lucky in terms of a bit of sun exposure. And then as people get into their 50s and 60s, I think often that they do just think, oh, actually, I can see what it's done. And that visible reminder of what the sun has done prevents them. So hopefully that is going to change. We talked before about this generation and younger generations being quite aware of, skin cancers and sun damage. And hopefully that will change the way that they actually, behave.
And also, I think, again, from a messaging point of view, it's becoming much more common now. And it's not just Face the Future. We're part of the UV Safety Initiative, and there's other retailers, other brands on that initiative as well. And I think we're all working together to make sure we promote the knowledge that UV exposure is really dangerous, what impacts that can have, and how it can help remedy that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing that also helps is having a mix of skin tones, because I think actually in the UK, classically, people, the minute the sun's come out, everyone's like, let's expose ourselves significantly. But actually, I think sometimes if you're not sort of trying to get a tan, or if you've got dark skin, you're much more careful about it. And so, for example, people are sort of covering up with things or hats. So, for example, if you go to Asia, I went to Asia a couple of years ago, and I was like, oh, I love it here, because everyone was like completely covered up. Yeah. And actually, I didn't look as crazy when I'm in my long sleeve swimming costume or I'm in my thing. So I think actually that's helping a bit as well, seeing that actually we don't all just have to like strip down to our thong bikini when the 20 degrees finally gets there, which is what happens in the UK a lot.
No, it does. And there's a cultural thing there as well. I mean, I've not been to Asia, unfortunately, not yet anyway, but when you see Asian people overseas, they're typically the ones that have got the big sun hat on and, almost covered head to toe. And
it is really refreshing for someone that I feel like always gets, looked at as like, oh, what is she wearing? She's covered up fully. For me, it was like, oh, thank goodness.
These are my people.
They're enlightened. Yeah, it's good.
Fantastic. What today's conversation highlights is that sun damage isn't always obvious and rarely does it happen all at once. It's something that develops quietly, shaped by small, repeated exposures that most of us wouldn't think twice about. And while that might feel concerning on the flip side, it does mean that small, consistent changes can actually have a meaningful impact over time. Emma, thank you for helping guide us through and let us understand what sun damage really looks like in practice, and for bringing a level of clarity to a topic that's often oversimplified, as we mentioned earlier today. And for everyone listening and watching, hopefully this episode will give you a clearer picture on how your everyday habits influence your long-term skin health. Thank you for listening to Skincare and Beyond, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like or share this episode with friends or family. Thank you.